In the previous video, I turned on the power on the Palo Alto firewall, PA-FW1. However, I've done absolutely nothing because in this video, I'd like to walk you through the initial bootstrapping and initial configuration of the Palo Alto firewall. So here's our Palo Alto firewall, and in my EVE-NG environment, I've configured it so that if I click on that object and telnet is the mechanism it's going to use to connect to it, it's automatically going to bring up for me secure CRT. So if you're using a slightly different method, totally fine. As long as you're getting a CLI over to the Palo Alto firewall, you'll be good to go. Now also, as far as some planning goes, PA-FW1 is going to have the last octet be 11. So Ethernet 1 will be 10.1.0.11. Ethernet 1/3 will be 23.1.2.11. And the literal management interface will also be .11. So that's 192.168.1.11. Now, by default, when an appliance comes up, it's going to try to use 192.168.1.1, which in many environments is a huge problem, especially if you're in a home environment, because you may already have your default gateway at that location. And these virtual appliances, even though initially they come up and try to use that, they will default back to a DHCP client status. And so once we connect to the command line, we'll be able to see what the IP address is. And then we have the option of either continuing our configuration at the CLI, at the command line, or we can go to HTTPS:// and then the IP address that it was assigned, and we can reach it that way over the management network. So let's bring up the console and let's go to work. So I'm going to go ahead and click here on PA-FW1, and that brings up the terminal emulator. In my case, I'm using Secure CRT, but any terminal emulator will do, including PuTTY, or the embedded one as part of EVE-NG. And I discovered something pretty interesting when a brand new Palo Alto device comes up. It takes a few minutes for it to be able to respond. And so the actual prompts change. So if you open up a console to it right away, we're going to see the initial login say something like this, VM login. And then after a few more minutes, it's going to change to PA-HDF. And these are both what I call fake outs. Which basically means you can't really log in. You can log in or try to log in, put the username and password, but it's going to say incorrect password. It's not going to respond correctly if you try to log on initially if either of these prompts are present. And then it's going to go to this one right here, PA-VM, and that is a winner chicken dinner. So it's at this point where we can go ahead and log in. And the default username is admin, and the default password is admin. And that's how we're going to log in initially. Also, if we had the console up earlier and this got an IP address via DHCP, it would actually show us there as well. However, since we missed that screen, I'll just show you how to log in, and then we can also see what IP address it currently has. All right, so I'm going to log in as admin, press enter, and the password is ADMIN, press enter. Oh, good. So the first thing it's going to force us to do is to change the password. So it's asking for the old password, which is still the old password of ADMIN. We'll press enter. And then a new password. There is some, I think, some default complexity you have to add to it. And if your password isn't as complex as the rules are, it will just tell you. So I've supplied a password. I'll put it in again to confirm. And then I'll press enter. All right, so I'm logged on. It says I'm currently using the default admin account credentials. Now, before we take a look at the IP address that we have associated with our management interfaces, I'd like to talk with you about two different categories. We'll go ahead and put a line there. Over here on the left, we have control. Sometimes it's referred to as the control plane or the control mechanism. And then over here on the right, we have the data path or the data plane. Also, with some vendors, they have something called the management plane, which is how we interact and work with that device. But the big differentiator here is that as we look at the management interface, it's going to have an IP address, it's going to have a default gateway. If we got it from DHCP, that's fine, or if we manually configure it, it's fine. But this management IP address is associated with the box as a whole. So this is our firewall. And for management purposes and communicating with it, like with SSH or with a graphical user interface like a browser, I think of that as being part of the control plane, which think of it like a separate out-of-band management system that's separate. And you might say, Keith, separate from what? And it's separate from what the users are going to use. So if we have a user, so let's say we have a user over here at this computer, maybe it's client 1, and they're going out to the internet, they are going to be sending traffic through the firewall on this interface, which in our topology is 1/1. And if that traffic is routed correctly, it'll be sending out 1/3. And this traffic from the user going through the firewall out to the internet, that is part of the data plane. So the routing and IP addressing and everything else regarding the data plane is separate from management. So initially, we want to configure the management interface so we can communicate with it and interact with it. And that could include SSH to connect to it on its management interface. It also could use HTTPS for the GUI. And all that management traffic is apart and separate from the actual data plane traffic. So all we're primarily concerned with now with the bootstrapping of this device is the IP address and the routing and the name resolution associated with the box itself, which is using the management interface. All right, so the question is, how do we actually see that? And the command to do that right here is show config space running. And you're thinking, why isn't it show running config? Some other vendor uses exactly that command. They probably wanted to avoid it. So show config running, we'll press enter. And I'll hit the space bar a few times to go page down. So this is the full running config on this box right now. And this is very Juniper-esque. And I think the people who started Palo Alto Networks had some experience in history with Juniper, so that may explain some of that. So if we scroll down to this section right here, which is device config, and then a subsection called system, and then type, it's specifying it's a DHCP client. We want to change that. We want to make it a static client with an IP address. And as part of that, we're going to want to configure a DNS server for it to use, and the IP address, and the default gateway. So at the moment, it's trained to be a DHCP client. And if we want to see what IP address is currently in use, we can do a show interface and a question mark and management. Show interface management. Press enter. So this is showing us right here that this is the IP address, 192.168.1.15. There's the mask, and there's the default gateway. This is all learned via DHCP. So if we wanted to, right now, we could open up a browser with HTTPS, //, go to this IP address, log in as admin, and we can start administering this Palo Alto firewall from the GUI. Or since we're right here at the CLI, we could also do it right here. And to do that, we're going to type in configure and press enter. And that puts us into configuration mode on the Palo Alto firewall. So the prompt changed from a greater than symbol now to a pound symbol. And from here, we can do set device config. I'm going to tab that out because it's now unique. System. And then I'm going to copy that because I can paste it in a few times and save myself a little bit of typing. So set device config system IP-address, and there is context-sensitive help as well. And for this system, we want the management IP address to be 192.168.1.11 with a net mask of 255.255.255.0. So the 0 just wrapped over here a little bit wacky for me over on the far left there. And as an example of doing this one smaller chunk at a time, we could right-click and say IP address of 192.168.1.11, press enter, hit the up arrow key, do net mask, and then we could add a default gateway the same way. Default gateway 192.168.1.1, and let's also set up DNS with a set device config system DNS. I'll tab that out, and the primary server is going to be 8.8.8.8. Oh, and I forgot something I want to add as well, and that is I want to go ahead and tell this type is static as opposed to dynamic for a DHCP address. So now, this configuration that we've just put in is part of the candidate configuration, which is very similar on a Juniper device. So if we want this to be in the running config, we would type in commit. That takes a moment or two to process that. All right, it looks like it is almost done. Fantastic. So we're still in configuration mode, so we'll type in exit to go back. And let's do a show interface management and just take a look. So there we have the IP address 192.168.1.11 with the default gateway. And let's also do a ping host 8888, which is out on the internet. I'm always happy, a little bit surprised too when that worked the first time. And let's also do some name resolution. Let's do a ping to host, and we'll go to www.paloaltonetworks.com, press enter, and that works too. That's great. So that lets us know that DNS is working, IP connectivity up to the internet is working. So if you're wondering, wait, how did that work again? How did that name resolution, all that good stuff work? Basically, we have one interface with the layer 3 IP address. That's the management interface that we configured. We also configured DNS and the default gateway. And so when we did the DNS request out to the internet, the traffic using the management interface went up to the default gateway at .1, who then was able to forward that off to the internet. Also, the default gateway here is also doing some flavors of PAT, port address translation, to swap out the private RFC 1980 address to something that's routable out on the internet. So then the request continued out for the DNS, the response came back, and then the firewall continued to do the ping requests once it got the information regarding what IP address was associated with that name. Now, the point here I also want to emphasize is that all of this traffic from the system at the moment is all going through the management interface. None of it is going through these interfaces because they're not even enabled yet. They're shut down. And also, these two interfaces are going to be part of the actual data plane, not part of the management network. So now, if we wanted to log on with a browser, we could go to https://192.168.1.11. We could log in as admin, and that would be the graphical user interface for this Palo Alto firewall. And we also could have made those changes regarding the IP address type with the GUI. In fact, let me show you that real quick as well. So we'll bring in a browser, and we'll go to https://192.168.1.11 and press enter. And it says your connection is not private, and that's because it has a self-signed certificate that my browser doesn't currently trust. That's okay. This is a brand new system. That's expected. We'll click on advanced and scroll down and click on continue. Now it's asking me to log in as admin, and we'll supply the password and click on login. All right, so let me make this a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger. So welcome to PanOS 10. Thank you very much. Please do not show that again. Click on close. And do we want to share telemetry data? I'm going to say, remind me almost every time, please. So on a screen like this, at first blush, there's a lot of information, but we don't have to consume every single tidbit on every single screen. What we need to know is from the basics of okay, where would I go for this basic function? So at the command line, we just changed the management interface address to be .11. If we were going to do that here in the GUI, let me show you exactly where we'd go for that. So in the config, the command was set device config. In fact, in our config logs, check it out, showing us the history of what was done right there. So to manage the box, think of the word device. And up here on the top, we have in uppercase, almost like it's shouting, device. And that is for the device itself. And with device selected, we have a whole bunch of options over here on the left. Those are fine. But the ones I want to point you to right here are these subtabs. And so if we wanted to modify just what we did on the CLI, if we wanted to do that here in the GUI, we click on device. And then the subtab of interfaces. And check it out, we have our management interface. It's got this IP address. If we wanted to modify those details, we just click here. There's a hyperlink. So we'll click on management. And then we go ahead and specify the details. So if we want this to be a DHCP client again, we can click the radio button to be a DHCP client, click OK, commit it, and in a few minutes it would be a DHCP client once again. But we want it to be static, so we're going to leave it like this. Also, this is showing us on the management interface what is being allowed. And by default, we're allowing HTTPS sessions, which is currently what we're using. And we're also allowing SSH sessions. And we're also allowing ping to this management interface. Also, if we wanted to lock down the source addresses of who is able to connect to this device, we could click on add here in the permitted IP addresses field. And then if we add any here, these are the only IP addresses and or subnets from which this firewall would allow those inbound management sessions. But by default, if you don't put a limit here on the right with a permitted IP addresses, it's simply going to accept any source IP address. As long as they log in and have the right credentials, they're in. So I'm not making any changes there, so I'll click on cancel. Let me minimize that. And let's go back to our topology. One of the key concepts regarding a firewall is the concept of rules, and most of those rules are going to involve the concept of zones. And this would be for the data plane. So a very popular methodology would be to take all the interfaces that connect over here to the inside network, like to the private corporate network, and put them in a zone. Maybe we call the zone inside zone. A lot of times we just call it inside or internal or trusted. And then we take all the interfaces that are facing untrusted networks or less trusted networks, and we could put them in another zone. And so maybe this is the outside or represents the outside, and maybe we create an outside zone called outside zone. Or maybe we create a zone called untrusted. And then we can set rules based on zones, such as if traffic is being routed through the firewall and the packet's coming in on an interface associated with the inside zone, and the traffic is being routed out of an interface associated with the outside zone, then drop it, or then allow it, or then do this inspection, etc. So as we build out this firewall for basic connectivity, in the next video, I'd like to walk you through the creation of zones which we can then associate with our interfaces on the firewall. So I'll see you in the zones video in just a moment. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.